everyone. Hi, I'm Vidhi Vashisht. I head Plain Language Services at Krystelis. Welcome to this webinar on PLSPs from Inception to Innovation. I hope you have all heard about PLSPs already. And in the last few years, we are seeing uptick in newer formats like video summaries and audio publications. And today's webinar is going to focus just on that. So I'm really excited to introduce my co-speakers to you today. Rachel Jenkins is head of plain language summaries at Taylor and Francis Group. She has worked in medical publishing for over 8 years. Rachel focuses on developing accessible formats and multimedia solution for publications. Gisu Dikotis is the head of global advocacy and strategic relations for Daiichi Sankyo. In her role, she helps patient voice be heard at Daiichi Sankyo and helps build stronger relationship with patient advocates around the world. With the real aim is to understand the needs of the patients and to learn from their experience in order to help build more relevant studies. Gisu has over 30 years of experience and has been involved in all early and late stage assets for the organization. Sachin Nadanachsewa is the publication's lead, Global Med Affairs Oncology at Daiichi Sankyo. She has more than 15 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry, with 10 years focused in medical communications. Sashi is a member of ISMAP and volunteers in the Patient Engagement Task Force. And Trishna Baradia is a multi award winning patient advocate and speaker. She works across the globe with multiple stakeholders, including industry, patient groups, charities, and nonprofit organizations, to embed the patient voice throughout the healthcare and life sciences ecosystem. She is also an experienced PLS reviewer for agencies, pharma, and publishers. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to have you all, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion today. Today's webinar, we are going to start with a very brief overview on PLSPs and other formats that I just mentioned for patient and public communication. I will be using formats or channels interchangeably during the webinar, and the majority of the webinar is going to focus on the impact of these different channels or formats and how some of the conversations today can help you choose the right way for communicating your science results with patients and public readers. And we'll end with comments on future trends that we anticipate in this space. Let's talk about plain language summaries. These are summaries that are written in everyday simple language so that scientific content can be explained easily and understandably to patients, families, and general public. These can be shared in a variety of ways. The very first one are text only summaries that are published alongside a publication, and they are usually appearing shortly after the title and often along with the scientific abstract. The PLSPs, as we know them, they are the standalone plain language summary article of a previous single or multiple publications. The supplementary PLSs are supplementary documents provided alongside publication, and you often find them as links provided within supplementary section. And when you think about their visual impact, similar to PLSPs, they can be really visually engaging because it allows sponsors to incorporate visual features, graphics to help aid understanding. And lastly, PLSs of a Congress abstract are just that, summaries of abstracts that are presented at a scientific Congress with the aim to improve understanding for the diverse audience that are present at the Congress. These documents are also getting translated for a wider reach and better understanding. Now, primarily, these documents are being written for patients, their families, caregivers, patient advocates, and advocacy groups. But we are learning that there are other groups that are also benefiting from it. So these can be non specialist healthcare professionals, time poor clinicians, community healthcare teams, as well as research funders and publishers. With the most recent Good Publication Practice update in 2022, there has been a strong support for this type of communication. It says that publications should support communication of scientific information to non-scientific audience through PLSs and other accessible formats like the one shown here, with video summaries, audio publications, and infographic abstract styles. And now I want to take an opportunity to invite Trishna to share her views, because when we are saying that these are being written for patients, we want to understand what relevance PLSPs and these formats hold. So, Trishna, what are your views on this topic?
Thanks, Vidhi. So I'd like to start by essentially setting the scene, because we're living in a world of more and more democratized information. And the internet, especially, and also the increased inclusion of patients, patient advocates, patient groups in medicine's development has meant that the way that we're accessing information, both sort of the information generally, but also then healthcare information specifically, it's changed. You know, there's an ever increasing volume of information that's available to patient communities and the public. But as a result of this, there's actually a huge amount of health misinformation out there. So there was actually a recent report in the UK that was done from Ipsos and the Patient Information Forum. And it showed that half of UK adults struggle to access trusted health information. And 1 in 10 UK adults had been affected by health misinformation. And this is by no means equitable either, because the figure rises to 1 in 5 people affected by misinformation if we're looking at ethnic minorities. So if we're looking at that as the basis, the foundation, we really need to be looking at PLSPs, different channels, different formats, as what I would say a moral and ethical responsibility from researchers to put their research findings out there in a way, in a format, in a language that's understandable to everyone, particularly when we have the rise of open access science as well. So if scientific information is going to be available to anyone that basically wants to search for it, regardless of what their health literacy is, their general literacy, their numeracy levels, education, geography, you know, you also have non-fluent English speakers. This information should be in a format and in a language that they can understand. Otherwise, we're just risking more misunderstanding, which can have a negative impact on healthcare decisions. And that's where things become really crucial, because we know that there's lots of general misinformation out there. When it comes to health information, these decisions that people are making due to the information that they are digesting is critical. You know, it could literally mean life or death. Patient communities are increasingly needing to be informed communities, because they need to be able to participate in effective shared decision making. They also need to be able to self-advocate. So again, we need access to scientific information that's in easy to understand formats. So I think it really comes down to there's an ethical and moral responsibility. We need to have more informed patient communities, and having scientific information in formats and through channels that actually speak to the very people who are accessing this information. That's what we need to be looking at. And like I said, PLSPs and these different formats that we're going to be looking at in a bit really speak to that.
You raised some really important points, Trishna, about informed decision making, self advocacy, as well as misinformation and how to tackle it. And if there are sponsors who are providing clear and easy to understand summaries that support the scientific information, I think that's half battle won. Thanks for those comments. And I want to now invite Rachel. From her perspective, I know Future Oncology, Future Science Group initially have been pioneers in really bringing out the plain language summaries of publication. And I see that you also have a video journal for video summaries. So I want to understand from you how these formats are evolving and what's driving the change.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different parts I wanted to just talk about in this section. So one of them is that a constant challenge driving the evolution of different formats of this content is the discoverability for that non-specialist audience. The traditional audiences for medical journals are not non-specialist audiences, so it's important, there's a need to be creative with the different formats and the ways of dissemination to get this content out to people that it is most relevant to. And that's really what initially drove the development of PLSPs, from those text-based PLS abstracts and from the supplementary graphical PLS that we were shown earlier, because being standalone articles themselves with their own DOIs, it makes PLSPs more discoverable and more searchable than their counterparts that are within scientific and medical articles. And there will be some slides coming up that I'll talk through in a minute, and the final slide will touch on the work that Taylor and Francis are doing with other publishers on a searchable PLS repository, and to try and help and advance this discoverability part even further. And then also, accessibility is obviously a key driver for the evolution of different plain language formats, including that availability of extenders to PLSPs and different articles. So things like videos, podcasts, language translations, and most recently, interactive versions of PLSPs as well. So, we've mentioned that PLSPs work towards health equity. They increase people's ability to understand their health. So it's important that there's options there to make it as inclusive as and accessible as possible for everyone. And I think there's broad benefits there. Provides options for people's different learning preferences. Some people just prefer watching a video versus reading a paper, and vice versa. Or if someone doesn't have the time, or if they're driving, for example, then a podcast is the perfect format. So it's really about increasing audience reach and engagement by offering these different options. But I think it's even more critical when you consider that 1 in 6 people globally live with significant disabilities, and that number is expected to rise with the aging populations, and people with disabilities often face more barriers to accessing care and health information than those without. So it's important that PLSPs as part of healthcare content is as inclusive and involves these extenders that offer different ways of absorbing the content to really help close those gaps as well. I don't know if anyone else had any comments on those points either.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. The fact that inclusivity is so important, and especially the point you raise about disabilities. I couldn't agree more. And I know that you have some very interesting data for our viewers to share as well on
Yeah.
PLSPs and other extenders. Do you want to share what data is telling us?
Yes. So we go on to the first slide. So the first slide is specifically about PLS abstracts. So this is data that I've got from metrics at Taylor and Francis specifically. So looking at downloads of different types of content. So this is PLS abstracts within other medical scientific articles. And to April 2025, we published 2,177 PLS. And what we did is we looked at all PLS published in our oncology journal, Future Oncology, in 2024, purely because that journal gets a high proportion of PLS within articles versus without. As you can see on screen, about a third of articles published in the journal in 2024 had a PLS compared to those that didn't. And what we saw on average was that having a PLS, the articles received a 25% increase in downloads compared to those without a PLS. So suggesting that having a PLS increases the reach and audience of their article. Next slide, please. So this is going on to PLSP metrics now. So we, from April 2025, published 325 PLSP articles to date. The graph on screen kind of shows the increase over the years. So we started with 1 in 2020, and then I think it was 110 around in 2024. With the majority topics being on oncology, then followed by rare disease, and then neurology and cardiology as well. Next slide, please. So looking at average downloads per PLSP, it was at 1,200, and that's taken into account PLSPs that were published right up until April 2025. So what we know from looking at data from over a year ago, the downloads are at around 2,000 per PLSP. So that suggests that they continue to get attention and are read with over time as well. Something else that we did was we looked, thank you. Something else that we did was we looked at altmetric scores of future oncology articles published from 2022 onwards, and this was all articles. And altmetric scores showcase kind of the public noise around an article, so things like social media mentions, blog posts, news articles, and that type of outreach. And it included PLSPs versus non-PLSP article types. Obviously, there's a big discrepancy in sample sizes. We hadn't published as many PLSPs in that time. So hopefully over time we'll be able to get more data as well. But what we found was that PLSPs on average had a much higher, a 38% higher altmetric score compared to the non-PLSP articles, again suggesting that they are being shared on social media, they're being shared on blogs more than a non-PLSP article. Next slide, please. So these couple of slides are just looking at the demographic data that we have. As all plain language content is published open access or free to access, if it's a PLS, then we don't have as detailed data on the users, but what we can do is look at things like geography. So this was across all PLSPs, and it shows that the highest proportion of readership comes from North America, closely followed by Asia, and then closely followed by Europe as well. Next slide, please. And then this was looking at traffic sources. So this can give us a really good indication of kind of the backgrounds of people that are accessing the content, whether that is more technical or non-technical. So we looked at where the traffic was coming from, and what we found was it was about a 50-50 split between technical and general sources. And what I would say, technical sources were search engines, were things like PubMed, Scopus, and general search engines were things like Google, Bing, and then obviously social media as well. So a surprising amount on Facebook in the social media split. We found that it was about 50-50, which is a much higher proportion of general sources when we're looking at non-PLSP articles as well. So it just suggests that that general audience is accessing and finding the content, as we mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So this slide is, this was a poster that myself and my colleague Sam Kavanagh, who is head of publishing solutions at Taylor & Francis and works closely on the video and podcast content as well, we worked on for the ISMAP annual meeting that happened last month, and we looked at the number of views of publications that had extenders versus those that didn't have extenders, and we specifically focused on clinical trial protocol articles and PLSP articles, so I've included the PLSP data in this presentation. And what we found was that PLSPs that had that extender content with the aim of increasing the reach did exactly that, and they had a 154% increase in downloads compared to those that didn't have the extender content, which we also found fascinating because it was such a big increase of the content. Next slide, please. I think this is the PLS Finder slide, yeah. So this is a poster on the left that Taylor and Francis Sage and Vicaris Publishing did at last year's ISMAP meeting, and it was a survey to find out how people find plain language content and how easy they find it. And it was essentially it was still very difficult to find. It was still challenging, and that there was a big unmet need to have a database to access this type of content. So over the last couple of years, that is something that Taylor and Francis Sage and Vicaris have been working on. We're now working with the Synergist to make it possible, and the plan is to launch a searchable engine for all plain language content of publishers that are involved in the initiative this year, which should hopefully massively kind of accelerate the reach of this type of content and really help people find what they're looking for and make a lot of headway against that challenge of discoverability. I think that's the last slide.
Yeah. And that's really amazing. Firstly, on PLS Finder, I just want to congratulate you and the other stakeholders involved.
Thank
I
you.
think it makes a world of difference because it is a challenge. It's great to see that, social media or general search are great ways, or almost 50-50 ways in which people are discovering PLSs. But still, if you are searching for a topic, it's not very easy right now if you Google it to reach to a relevant PLSP. So having this, which is cross publisher, is a great resource for everybody to find relevant information that they are looking for. I think the points you raise around all metric score, that also makes a lot of sense, Rachel. I had no clue that Facebook would be a place where people would find publications on. So thank you. There's already a question for you in the chat. So the question is, you mentioned that because this is an open source, so there's limited amount of information that you can find around users who are accessing. But the question says that, is there a way to ask users if they wish to share some of the demographic details like disease state, age, location, feedback on the resource, including their ability to understand and where appropriate take action from it?
Yeah, so this is something that surveys are useful for. There's been quite a lot of survey research into how people use the content. So, for example, that's a poster on screen was how people find the content, and that's quite useful for gathering different, more detailed demographic data. And actually, one of the things that we spoke about as a group when thinking about this panel was if there's any data on non-specialist HCPs and if they're using the content. So I know that, for example, Open Pharma looked at this exact thing using a HCP survey, and there is a poster on Figshare of the results. But it's essentially they found that HCPs are writing and reading plain language material, and that only 5% of HCPs had not read or used a PLS when it was used in an article, which I thought was really interesting. So definitely survey-based data is a good way to get it. And also we're in touch with patient advocacy groups because we disseminate this type of content to them as a publisher. So in discussions like those, but it would be useful if we could kind of have the data from the specific articles. But yeah, because they're open access, then it's not something that we have.
Understandably. And probably I'll take another question before I ask some of our other panelists to make comments. This one is a bit tricky one. I know probably a lot of people in our audience might have had that struggle. So PLSPs, they are becoming more common, but there are only very limited number of publishers who are making, publishing them. The question is, why do you think some publishers remain resistant to the idea? Is it not wanting it, or not knowing how to implement, or mix of both?
Yeah,
Any
I think
comments?
implementation is quite a key thing because there are slightly different processes compared to a standard article. So, for example, at peer review, at the production stages, and then it's really important to kind of have the resource to do the dissemination part as well, to get it in front of kind of the right audiences. Like I said, we share it with patient groups, and I think that it's important to kind of be educated on those type of things. You know, at Taylor and Francis, when we look at rolling out across other journals, for example, that don't publish it, then we have to consider like the different stakeholders that need education around the value of the content, the processes, and kind of to get them on board as well. So it's something within publisher and external as well. I definitely think something like PLS Finder is going to be really important for getting other publishers on board, because like I said earlier, I think it's going to really accelerate PLS. And the more we can showcase the value, which we are starting to build up a bigger picture now, showcase the value, then I think the more publishers will get on board, hopefully.
Fingers
Can
crossed.
I just add something in there? So, and I think Rachel's touched on a really important point, because so generally, publishers, like many other stakeholders within the sort of medicines development life cycle and life sciences, hadn't traditionally been working with patients or for patients in the way that we're now seeing co-creation. There's a partnership. So there is a process involved in order to make sure that this is done in the right way. And there, like with anything, there's always going to be sort of innovators, the ones who are, you know, really pushing forward, and then the ones who are then coming through as the value is being shown, as there's more guidance available in terms of being able to put in place those processes. So as Rachel said, I think as more publishers get on board, it will be a case of, if you're not doing it, then you're going to be left behind. But to do this properly, you do need those processes in place, because like I said, it's very much, you know, in the same way that, you know, pharma companies, for instance, you know, 30 years ago weren't working with patients in the way that they are now. Publishers are now catching up.
That's a great perspective. Thanks, Trishna. And probably let's switch gears. We would now be switching more towards a panel discussion. And Trishna, I want to ask your comments on different formats or channels of communication. What are your thoughts? Why do these different channels matter?
Well, I think Rachel's actually already touched on some of this, because it really very much boils down to personalization. You know, different people have different requirements, and this is what really makes it imperative. And I've already spoken about this. You need to know the communities that you're aiming at. You need to be working with them, because you're going to be, when you're doing things for patients, you're going to be more likely to be catering to people who have disabilities, sensory requirements, different learning styles, different preferences. So if, for instance, you're doing a PLS in a disease area where vision problems are common, then it would be beneficial to include audio narrations to a PLS, or do a podcast format. A patient community that commonly experiences cognition issues might benefit from a video format, because that might be easier to process than a whole load of written text. We also need to look at the demographics of the patient community. So if you've got a patient community that generally has a younger or pediatric demographic, then again, you might want to consider cartoons or animations in the way to transform the PLS into something that's essentially more digestible for a younger audience. I've seen actually when I was doing some of the research for this, I actually saw some really wonderful examples of, they were actually the lay summaries of clinical trial results. So they weren't actually attached to a publication. But they were lay summaries that had been produced for pediatric trials as video animations and comic strips. And I thought that was wonderful, because that is specifically speaking to the very audience that you're trying to target. And then what these lay summaries did was, you had the section that was aimed at the people who are living with the condition, so the pediatric population. But then you had what I would call a more traditional written lay summary, which would have been aimed at the caregivers, the parents. So we also need to look at, not necessarily just thinking about one format for a patient audience. We also need to look at, and we haven't touched on this yet, digital access and digital literacy. Is the PLS in a format that can be made available as a hard copy for people who can't access online versions? So if, for instance, you're doing a podcast, is there a transcript available that can be printed out and given to somebody who may not be able to access a podcast online, for instance? And then also dissemination. So, obviously digital formats might be easier to disseminate more widely. So that might factor into the reasons, again, why different formats are needed, because the wider we can get these PLS out to different audiences, different patient communities, the better. Basically, we need to make sure that people are getting the information in a way that best helps them to understand it. Different formats help to facilitate that. And that's why we need to be looking at these different channels and multiple formats.
Yeah, you summed it up pretty well. I think it's all around accessibility and making information available. And Gisu and Sashi, you both have done quite a lot of work in PLSPs, and we want to hear your thoughts, what it means to really make them available, create them, and how the whole process goes. So,
I
Gisu,
could
your
start
thoughts.
off and then share with Sashi. When I first started in 2018 doing these patient-led summaries, I used to hear from patients that they would translate the articles word for word, but then didn't understand what the meaning was. So that was like a light bulb that came on that said, we need to really translate in a sensitive way the science into terms that patients and their caregivers would understand. And that's when, I started with my company, the H. Sankyo, to make sure that each one of our pivotal studies would have a lay publication with it. And that was our commitment to the patient community. What I've heard from the patients and the patient advocates now is that they can't find them easily, as Rachel mentioned. So it would be really nice to have them in one place, readily accessible, searchable. We share what we create with the patient community, and we involve them in the creation. We ask for their input. We would like to know if it's usable for them, because it's no use creating something that no one will use. The goal is to have that shared decision-making discussion be more balanced, so patients can actually learn and know the types of questions that they need to ask their healthcare providers. But now I'll pass it over to Sashi, who can talk about the many different types of lay publications that we've created.
Thanks, Gisu. So where we work at Daiichi Sankyo, we do offer open access, or rather we pay for open access so that all our readers can access our articles, including plain language summaries. I'd like to switch gears a little bit to something that Trishna touched upon, which is co-creation of materials with patients. And we've done some interesting articles over the last couple of years with patients. It's been fairly easy because I sit within medical affairs, and so does Gisu. So she's head of patient advocacy and I'm a publications lead. So there's close contact within our company. And we've reached out through Gisu's contacts with patient advocacy groups to find patients who are interested in partnering with us to develop publications. And last year we did two things which are, they're not strictly speaking plain language summary publications, but they're rather patient-friendly materials. And these two publications came about because one of the insights that Gisu had gathered at her various patient advisory boards was that patients understand, at least in oncology, they understand certain terms like overall survival and progression-free survival. But when it comes to some other terms that we in the medcoms field are very familiar about, they don't quite understand it. And so we developed with patients and patient advocates and HCP oncologists 2 publications explaining the efficacy endpoints used in oncology clinical trials and also the safety endpoints used in oncology clinical trials. And again, touching on what Rachel and Trishna have mentioned previously, we kind of did these as multimedia articles. So it was a podcast discussion amongst the authors, some of whom were patients. We also had a little video where the HCP oncologist explained the value of these publications. And we also had some nice infographics to actually explain efficacy endpoints and patient-reported outcomes to patients in a patient-friendly manner.
That's a great example of co-creation and why that should be done. And something Gizu, you mentioned that there's no use of creating something if nobody is going to use it. And that's at the essence of why we should be even thinking about it. I already have a question where probably Sashi and Gizu, your inputs will be very helpful. So the question is, who is responsible for producing the extenders? Assuming that it's the author following journal guidance. So how do you navigate that? Like, how do you find journals who are open to these multimedia channels?
So Future Oncology is a great example of a journal which does plain language summaries and patient-friendly material. So we've been tending to submit our articles there. And what we do at Daiichi Sankyo is that for pivotal trials, we do a plain language summary publication in Future Oncology. We've also made use of their options for translating these into a variety of languages, which is great because not everybody reads English all over the world. So basically, we, the sponsor, work with the authors and decide right from the beginning, are we going to do a publication extender? Are we going to do a plain language summary publication? And so it sort of moves in parallel or slightly later than the original publication.
The only thing I was going to add to Sashi is that a lot of the peer-reviewed journals talk about the importance of having a patient-lay summary, but they don't allow them in their publication. And that's a shortcoming, right? We need to make sure that we push to have them consider patients as an audience that has more power in their decision-making about treatments. So it's really important for us collectively as a community, push for patients to have a voice in that process and get their information similar to physicians at the same places. So those peer-reviewed journals should be open to having these lay publications available as well.
This is also why it's really important to start to be getting patients involved in publication planning, because often, and I've been part of various initiatives, often it's patients who are the ones who ask, is it going to be open access? Is there going to be a plain language summary accepted? Which are the journals which are patient friendly? Because no longer should we only be looking at essentially altmetrics and impact factor as a way of measuring how, as a way of measuring the success of a publication. So particularly if we're looking at publications which do have PLS attached to them, we should be looking at maybe measuring that success slightly differently.
That's a great point. And another question that has come up is again related to the content of PLSPs. And I think probably everyone on the panel would have some opinion on it. So the question, I think the viewer thinks that PLSPs probably focus more on advantages of an intervention rather than giving a balanced approach around advantages and risks associated with it. So, could you please comment, how do you balance? I know how important it is for all of us in the process to give a very balanced overview of what the research is telling us. So,
Can I
yeah,
start with,
Trishna,
well, so
absolutely.
one thing that PLS are not, they are not promotional. Basically, PLS is they're just a plain language reflection of the original peer-reviewed article. You can't put things in which aren't in the peer-reviewed article, and a good PLS will contain essentially everything, the side effects, the risks and benefits. This is where you need a good review process. And that review process needs to be very much multi-stage. So the sponsor needs to be reviewing it. It needs to go through an independent patient review process. It should be being reviewed by the medical, if there's medical writers involved, that they should be reviewing it. If you've got that multi-stage process, then if there is a PLS, which, don't get me wrong, I've sometimes reviewed PLS and I've been a bit, I don't think this language is quite neutral, and actually there's some content missing from the original, which I think should go in, and that could make it more balanced. Vast majority will automatically contain that, because basically you're just translating content from the original article. That original article would have been peer reviewed.
We also include the original authors as authors of the patient lay summaries, because it's important to have that connection so they can review that it is the translation of the materials that they originally put out. So, Sashi, I'm not in publications, I'm in patient advocacy, but the goal is to have materials that are not dumbed down, but translated, made easier for patients so they can read and understand it at their level.
And also be able to have conversations with their healthcare professionals. So this is also something which I think sometimes gets forgotten, that PLS aren't just around, they're not just about being a standalone piece of material that the patient is going to be looking at with no other input from anywhere else. They are essentially a tool to be able to have those informed conversations with their healthcare professional. And that's the really important thing to take away from them. They are a tool, and potentially they could take a PLS in with them when they're having a consultation, and that can then be used as a prompt to have those conversations and those discussions about treatment, care, interventions, etc.
That's a great reminder. And so she just want to check if you want to make any other comment on making sure that it's a very balanced view on the research.
Yes, so we definitely have the authors from the original publication as authors on the PLSP, and I believe many other sponsors also do that. I have seen certain PLSPs where they've also brought in a patient advocate or a patient to comment on the article and how that particular treatment, for example, could benefit that particular patient community. So it tends to be a balanced article,
Balanced,
in my opinion.
absolutely. And Rachel, if there was an instance, supposedly, I know that once a PLSP gets submitted, of course, you have your own peer review process and even patient review process as well. Can you comment a bit on that, please?
Yeah, so all PLSPs undergo a two-stage review process, and one is by like kind of standard scientific review where they compare it to the original publication and make sure that it's accurately summarizing. And then the other is the plain language review to make sure that the language is the right level and the right quality. and they obviously cross over, but there's kind of those two stages to make sure that it's kind of a catch-all. And then also the point about author engagement, one of this may have already been said, so sorry if it has, but we at Taylor & Francis, we require a minimum of one author from the original publication at least. Most of the time it is the majority of authors from the original publication, but we require one, and we also do encourage patient authorship, like Sasha said.
That's great to hear. So hopefully there are multiple levels of checks to ensure whatever that's coming out is a balanced view on the research publication. There's also another question asking if PLSPs are a mandate for all publication going forward or good to have. I don't think they are a mandate, at least not anytime soon. But any
It should
comments?
be. They should be.
There are some companies which have publicly said that they are pledging that, certain, like for example, all I can't remember which company it is. There's one company that has said that all their human trials will all have PLS attached to them. At the minimum, the 250 word text summary. So companies themselves are going forward and talking and making these commitments. And I think this is actually a really good place to just emphasize there is a difference between plain language summaries of publications and the lay summaries of clinical trial results that are mandated by the EU. So they are different. These are plain language summaries of peer-reviewed publications. They're not the lay summaries of clinical trial results, which are mandated in Europe.
Correct.
But those clinical trial results only go to those who participated in the trial, where these publications are broadly available to the general public, including patients, providers, and everyone else. So that's really important to differentiate. We are not mandated to do it, although we do all of the European version of the lay summaries for the research that was done. This really is our, compassionate use of what we can do for patients to bring them into the fold and have them better understand what the research community is doing on their behalf.
Yeah. Just want to add very quickly on that. The early summaries of trial results that are mandate are getting published on these clinical trial databases that governments have. But again, the question of discoverability and accessibility come, how easy it is to find. And I think we should be looking at that as well a bit more. So I think looking at the chat as well, I think some of our viewers are still new to PLSPs, or maybe just getting started. So Gisu and Sashi, I know you mentioned as early as 2018 that you started thinking about these formats. Any advice for people who are just thinking of getting these out there or considering whether this is the right thing for them?
Well, one of the questions I saw in the chat was, I think, what are the resources for learning how to develop these materials? So we as the sponsor work with many medical communication agencies, and medical writers within those agencies are trained to write in plain language. So it is an art, and it sometimes can be difficult at the beginning when you start writing. I was a medical writer previously, but there are resources out there, and I think if you take the time to Google, you'd probably find the correct information.
PFMD.
I believe AMWA, I know American Medical Writing Association used to sometimes have sort of workshops on how to do plain language writing.
PFMD has some resources around the development of plain language summaries. So does Envision the Patient. They've got a plain language summaries toolkit. Yeah. And then various publishers that are accepting plain language summaries, some of them actually have some really, really good guidance. Taylor & Francis is one of them. They have some really good guidance available on their websites as well. But I have to echo what Sashi has said, that there are there are agencies out there that are very much specializing in plain language summaries. And I would say if you're looking for a vendor, then really dig deep into what is their process for developing plain language summaries. So who are they involving? What is their review process like? Are they involving patients? Because some agencies have their own patient review panels as part of the development process. So I would really dig deep into that to make sure that the vendors that you are working with are also working in a collaborative way with the stakeholders that are pertinent to PLS development.
The only other thing I was going to add is just get started. I have to tell you, it's important to get started. Don't be afraid. Be sensitive to the patient community. Ask questions. Don't just create something for the sake of creating it. Ask the questions of the need for it and how best we can fill that need. So just get started. It's really important to have these for patients.
Absolutely. And I think when we started doing these plain language writing back in 2015, I think, as Sashi, you mentioned, probably we were just trying to figure it out and understand what works, what doesn't work. Is it understandable? So it became very important for us to really engage with a patient and public community. So getting feedback, trying to understand whether what we have done really is making sense or not, and asking questions really to get that message clear. And I think when we are developing, some of these researches are really complex, and it takes a lot of effort to get them to a level that it makes sense without losing the meaning and importance it holds. And I think those are the bits we benefit most when we are engaging with patient reviewers, to understand whether we are really hitting the mark or not. So I'm glad that we brought in that conversation as well, which is really, really important.
I just
And it's,
wanted, sorry, I just
yeah,
wanted to mention one thing. So I'm really glad that Future Oncology has like a patient or patient advocate as part of their reviewer panel, because sometimes we've submitted a plain language summary infographic, for example, and since we're so well versed in the material, we think, well, that's simple enough, and then we get back reviewer comments, and I've often, oh wow, I never realized that this PLS was still complicated. So it's nice to get different perspectives from patient reviewers.
It's not just about looking at the language, it's also looking at, say, sometimes when I'm reviewing, I have a bit of a giggle because I see, for instance, the use of a chart, for instance, which may make sense to, somebody who's in the scientific community, but I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, I don't know how to read this. And so it's looking at not just the language, but even looking at the way in which the, figures are being displayed, statistics are being displayed. I just saw, it wasn't a plain language summary of a publication, but it was plain language materials where a pie chart had been used. And I suggested, actually, why don't you use stick figures? It was talking about the randomization process and the chances of being allocated to a placebo or to the study group. And it was being demonstrated as a pie chart. And I said, actually, use some stick figures, because that will actually speak directly to, well, if you're one of these two people, then you will get this. If you're one of these, then you will get that. So looking at that sort of visual representation, all of that is really important to have that patient perspective, because often some of these graphs and the way in which the statistics are presented just aren't understandable to non-scientific experts.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, a very important point. It's not just the content, but how we present it. I know we are almost towards the end of our webinar today. So I want to ask my favorite question. What does future look like to you? How the space is evolving? So maybe Gisu, do we start with you first?
Of course, for me, it would be all sponsors of trials should have these included in every single trial. And just to make it more understandable and sensitive to the patient's needs, I think my vision would be to have organizations like Rachel's and other publishers pool all of these together for easy access for patients.
That's
Thank you.
perfect. Thank you. And Sashi.
So I know that various sponsors and medical communication agencies are using generative AI to develop plain language summaries. And so, if you're at home and you have access to ChatGPT, you can, in theory, take a complicated publication and put it into that. But I think there is still the human element necessary, because just because there's a publication on, let's say, lung cancer, a certain type of lung cancer, and if I put that into Chat GPT, I mean, is that particular lung cancer sort of important for me? Do I have that particular type of a cancer? So while I see that generative AI is sort of pushing the frontier, I think that there will be medical writers and publication planners still necessary to, review these things. And
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, and you bring up a very important and current topic, generative AI. So something that at Krystelis also we have developed as our own AI PLSP tool to augment the writing process, but in no way replace the QC, the subject matter expertise required to really create authentic PLSPs. So I think I completely agree with you there, Sashi. It might be something that we would be using more and more of in future, and we'll see how the process evolves. Rachel, your thoughts on what future looks like for the space?
So hopefully just more of everything, more patient-centered publications, more PLSPs, more patient authorship, more extenders, and through education of all stakeholders, align guidance between publishers as an article type, PLS Finder, which will hopefully be the big thing this year. So yeah, I'm very excited, and I think the future looks very bright.
Perfect. I couldn't agree more. Trishna, how about you?
I think it's mostly been said. I think so. I would like to see potentially again using AI as a tool. I've been involved in various research pieces and looking at generative AI, and I think it's getting better, definitely. And there is going to be a place for AI, and I think we should be leveraging that so that we've got the ability to produce more PLS faster in multiple formats in a way that speaks to the very communities that we're trying to reach. So I think it's a very exciting future. We will still have the human element of medical writers, as Sashi said, medical writers, publication planners, patient advocates and patient groups in review process and co-creation and co-development. So I think it's looking very optimistic, and I hope that if we run this webinar again in say a year's time, we'll be talking about a PLS finder, the discoverability is better, and we'll be already leveraging AI to be producing more of these, because then also if we have more out there, we can also be able to demonstrate the value a lot better as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Rachel, Trishna, Gisu, and Sashi. I couldn't thank you enough. And I also want to recognize our viewers because you all were so engaged. Thank you so much. I think we tried to answer as many questions as we could. Some of the comments were also super interesting and relevant for this topic. So thank you, everyone, for your time. And I hope you have a great weekend. Bye,
thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.